I've been skiing ever since I could walk. My parents, who once competed in ski racing and even met through it, insisted that my siblings and I learn from the very start. Fast forward roughly 20 years, and here I am. This account took place a few winters ago when I was 21 and a senior in college. Everyone knows that Vermont offers the best skiing in the Northeast. It was supposed to be just another trip. It was me, Jaden, Ryland, and Amir. I can't even recall which mountain we hit that time since Jaden had organized everything and Ryland was driving. What stands out is that the resort was enormous, with roughly 7 lifts serving different peaks. If I had to guess, it might have been Killington. We skied almost 2 full days, and I'm convinced there were trails we missed because the area was so vast. On the second day, after having mapped out our favorite runs from the day before, we planned to challenge ourselves further, pushing our limits as per tradition. I'd be lying if I said we weren't armed with a stash of fireball shooters to keep the energy high. We were having an incredibly fun time. Even the double black diamonds retained their thrill, and racing down each slope felt like its own little contest. With about an hour left until the lifts closed, we were all exhausted. Yet we knew that as soon as we hit the road home, we'd start missing the mountain instantly. As we debated how best to wrap up the day at the lift's summit, 2 girls, notably without helmets, approached us. Now this might sound odd to some, but I wouldn't do the story justice without mentioning that these girls, one brunette, one blonde, were stunning, and I don't use that word lightly. They were, objectively, 2 of the most gorgeous women I'd ever seen, which completely disarmed us. They introduced themselves as Taylor and Devon, and we quickly began making small talk. They mentioned being bored because the mountain was crowded with older skiers, something I'd actually commented on the day before, so it made sense that they'd come over to a group of young guys around their age. Devon came across as an experienced skier, peppering Amir with technical questions about his gear. It turned out that Amir and Ryland owned their high-end skis, unlike Jaden and me who always rented, which clearly impressed the girls. Taylor even remarked about our fireball shooters, and we jokingly replied that the alcohol unleashed our secret skiing abilities, a silly comment that made them laugh. To our surprise, Devon produced an unmarked bottle and teased us for sticking with a drink as mild as Fireball. The 4 of us accepted the challenge and eagerly took swigs from her bottle. I could tell it pushed Ryland a bit over the edge, as he's known to drink more than he should, so it wasn't entirely unexpected. I made a mental note to pace myself because something about the whole situation felt off. I couldn't quite believe that these 2 girls would be interested in a bunch of silly kids like us, especially when our faces were nearly hidden by our helmets. Still, things were going well. Amir was his usual, overly flirtatious self, and Taylor seemed receptive, so I didn't complain. I figured we'd simply spend the rest of the day on the slopes with these girls, which wasn't a bad prospect at all. Maybe they even had plans for after the lifts closed. Then, out of the blue, Devon asked if we'd ever skied a trail called Devil's Forest, a name I didn't recognize. Our other friend, Chase, a human GPS who would have memorized every trail, wasn't with us that day. We admitted we hadn't, and they explained it was a glade trail, one that was rather obscure and rarely open. For anyone who doesn't know, glades are trails that weave between trees, giving you that forest skiing experience. Since we actually loved skiing glades more than anything, the Devil's Forest Trail immediately piqued our interest. We told them we were game, and they motioned for us to follow. Before long, we reached a narrow point where they instructed us to unclip our skis as we had to walk a short distance uphill. I could tell we were in a pretty remote part of the mountain. The snow was pristine and untouched, and there wasn't a soul in sight, but the promise of an adventure was exhilarating, so I didn't hesitate. Drunk and curious, we removed our skis and trailed after the girls up the mountain. Amir and Ryland surged ahead, probably eager to flirt more, while Jaden and I hung back a bit to give them space. As we followed, I noticed Jaden looked uneasy, so I asked what was on his mind. I like to think of us as the sensible ones. After all, Amir was impulsive and unpredictable, and Ryland would chase a girl, even if it meant risking a fall off a cliff. Jaden remarked that it was odd for a trail to be inaccessible directly from a ski lift, which I agreed with, since I'd never had to walk uphill to reach a run before. We decided to keep a close watch, thinking, what harm could 2 girls possibly do to a group of 4 burly guys? They led us into the forest until the terrain leveled off. Jaden and I caught up with the rest, and it was clear that Ryland and Amir had already made significant progress. Ryland had his arm around Devon, who was laughing and smiling. They pointed ahead, where the path suddenly sloped downward. I sighed, realizing once again how much we could have used Chase's navigational skills. He'd have known exactly where we were and where the trail was heading. Still skeptical, Jaden asked the girls if they were sure this was a legitimate trail. They confirmed it, adding that it would eventually bring us back to the lifts. Before I could add anything, Devon whipped out the bottle again, insisting we finish it. Amir and Ryland gulped down hearty swigs, but when the bottle reached Jaden, He claimed he'd had enough. The moment he said that, I could have sworn Devon's smile briefly turned into an angry scowl, but when I blinked, her smile was back. I must have been the only one who noticed, because my friend's expressions remained unchanged. Then, with a seductive smile and playful bat of her eyes, Devon coaxed Jaden to take the bottle, and though he did so reluctantly just to quiet her, when it finally came to me, I raised the bottle to my lips but stopped short of drinking. Everything about that moment was setting off alarm bells, so I handed the bottle back to Devon, who tucked it away. That's when it hit me. I hadn't seen either girl drink a drop. I spent about half an hour checking my phone as the lift's closing time approached, trying to conjure up an excuse for not tackling the trail, arguing that we wouldn't have enough time to get back and forth from where the girls had parked. Yet they insisted we'd make it, explaining that the lifts were connected at the bottom. Then, without warning, they announced we were wasting time and bolted toward the slope, daring us to follow. Amir and Ryland immediately took off, clearly hoping for a positive outcome at the bottom, while Jaden and I, though reluctant, felt we had no choice but to comply. I let Jaden lead the way, since the slope still looked challenging, and skiing through a forest is no joke. I'm not entirely sure what I was expecting, but when we finally reached the bottom, I felt relief upon seeing all four of them laughing and flirting as they had before. However, as Jaden and I caught up with the group, something was off. There was no lift in sight, just an endless expanse of forest. I demanded to know where the lift was, and the girls brushed off my concerns, assuring me it was nearby and that they'd take us there in a few minutes. I started to relax, thinking I'd been worrying for nothing, until while rubbing my eyes, I heard a distinct thump in the snow. When I looked up, I saw Ryland sprawled out on his back, completely passed out. The girls laughed and called him a lightweight, but I sensed it was more serious than that. Before I could react, Amir had also collapsed. Panic set in, and I rushed over, unclipping my skis as I went, silently thanking my luck that they still seemed to be breathing normally, even though I was utterly horrified. Jaden stepped forward, demanding to know what the hell was going on. The girls appeared genuinely shocked, insisting they had no idea what was wrong. But before he could take another step, Jaden too crumpled into the snow. I stood frozen in disbelief, struggling to comprehend the gravity of what was happening. My head began spinning, and I was sure I'd be next. The girls had long dropped the act. They stared at me as if waiting for me to pass out. Feeling dizzy and unable to stand, I sank down into the snow. I demanded to know what substance they had given us, but they didn't respond or move. I yelled repeatedly, yet they remained unresponsive. I wanted to get up, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. I managed to keep my eyes open the whole time. Eventually, Taylor turned to Devon and muttered something like he must not have drunk enough, her tone laced with irritation. Devon cursed under her breath and then informed Taylor that they had to leave. Still frozen in place after unclipping my skis, I watched as they gathered Amir and Ryland's skis before trudging off into the woods. I knew I had to do something. I couldn't just let them run off with my friend's skis, especially since hauling 2 pairs each through deep snow would slow them down. After a few more minutes, as I slowly regained control of my body, I stumbled along their tracks. It was eerie how far they'd gotten, despite the extra burden. Eventually, I looked up and saw them in the distance, far ahead. I figured that as long as I could keep them in sight, I'd eventually catch up. I followed for a few minutes until the forest opened into a clearing that led to a road. We must have been on the far side of the mountain, which made sense in hindsight. That's when I noticed a van parked in the distance. I froze at the edge of the woods as one side of the van slid open and 4 burly men stepped out to intercept the girls. The girls signaled for the men to get back into the van, and one of the guys even pointed directly at me. That's when I realized I was in way over my head and felt like an idiot for leaving my friends, helpless and unconscious, out in the cold. The men in the van appeared to be debating whether to pursue or leave, and I wasn't about to wait and see. I started wobbling back along my own tracks, confident that I'd be able to find my friends again. I eventually found them still passed out. Assuming Jaden had drunk the least, I shook him awake. A few handfuls of snow to the face did the trick, and he became lucid enough to speak. I told him what had happened, still in shock, and together we tried waking up Amir and Ryland, but to no avail. Jaden and I resigned ourselves to hoping those men wouldn't come after us, and thankfully, they never did. I might not be here to recount this tale if they had. We waited for about an hour until our friends finally stirred, and once they did, we relayed every detail. We had a million questions. Who were those girls? Who were those other guys? What were they planning to do to us? It was chilling to imagine what might have happened if I hadn't been quick enough to pretend to drink. In the best case scenario, we'd have merely woken up robbed. But even that would have been awful. Something tells me that no one would go to such extremes just to rob a group of broke, college-age kids. Besides, who carries valuables when skiing? Sure, Amir and Ryland's expensive skis might have been tempting targets, but it still seemed like overkill. And how would they even know we had high-end skis instead of rentals? Nothing added up. Finding the car was a nightmare, reporting it to the police was a hassle, and the drive back was equally dreadful. The mountain staff swore they'd identify those responsible, though we had to hit the road immediately, and the police promised to update us if anything surfaced. I think the story even made local news, but years later, nothing has been recovered. To this day, we have no idea what sort of substance was slipped into our drinks. Nothing online ever mentioned something that could work so quickly and effectively in such a small dose. Our best guess was that it was a cocktail of drugs, which would explain why all my friends felt so woozy when they came to. Those girls and whoever else was behind the whole thing were truly disturbed. I can only hope it was just an elaborate robbery and nothing more sinister.